Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Vancouver Life Real Estate Podcast. And on this podcast, we're going to talk about the Homes for People initiative that's recently been released by the provincial government. We're going to talk about what it looks like. What is it? Do we think it's going to work? How does it work? We're also going to look at what the government has done in the past and whether that has worked. We look at all these new government initiatives, and a lot of the time it's just lip service and we don't see any results. So what have they done in the past? Has it worked? Where are we now? We're going to look at the secondary suite renovation analysis here, where the government is going to give you a loan up to 20%, which you can recover up to $40,000 to renovate a suite. However, there's some really weird strings attached to this that may not make sense. We're going to look at the anti-flipping tax, and also municipalities have been given housing targets that they need to hit, supply housing targets they need to hit. Will that be possible? We'll see. As you can clearly tell with policies like this, there's a lot going on in our real estate market. So the question remains, what does this mean to you? How does this affect your property? There's so much change taking place right now that I don't think any of us, including yourselves, really know what the best course of action is. So if you have questions about what it means to you, just reach out to the contact information below. Let's have a discussion and open up your world with respect to real estate. All right, Dan, we're going to get into it here. So Homes for People. It's a new plan that the government has brought out in terms of trying to create more housing and more affordable housing quickly for people. We'll see. Well, let's look at the major points first, and then we'll kind of get into it. So the purpose of this particular plan is to deliver more middle-income, small-scale, multi-unit housing that people can afford, including townhomes, including duplexes, triplexes, through sweeping zoning changes and proactive partnerships. One thing I should mention with respect to this, a lot of the information we were given for this particular plan, or a lot that's on the government website, it's very top level. Again, much like the Liberal campaigns and everything that we saw at that time, there really isn't a whole lot of substance here. So bear with us. With respect to that, where we're going to see sweeping zoning changes, I'm assuming they're referring to the Plex plan, such as we're seeing here in Vancouver, where we're going to see things like single-family homes that can be rezoned to 4plexes and 6plexes, depending on the size of the property that you have. All right, another part here, we're looking at offering forgivable loans for homeowners to build rental secondary suites, but those have to be rented at below market rates to increase affordable rental supply quickly. We'll get into that in some detail here shortly. Again, really what constitutes below market rent, and how long do I have to rent it for at that rate, and how much do I get back from the government? We're going to look at building thousands of more affordable homes for renters, Indigenous people on and off reserves, women and children leaving violence, building thousands more on-campus student housing units. Again, there's not a whole lot of information here, so we don't know if that's 2,000 units or if it's 20,000 units. It's very unclear. It just sounds like a really nice promise, and I'm all for it so long as there's a real action plan behind it. They've also talked about delivering thousands of new homes near public transit, launching BC Builds to use public lands to deliver affordable homes for people. Where are these public lands? What do those homes look like? And who's going to build them? Then on top of that, introducing a flipping tax, or I should say an anti-flipping tax, to discourage short-term speculation. So if you want to fix up one of Vancouver's old and decrepit, falling apart homes, you're now going to get penalized for doing that. So I'm a little skeptical on those, and I don't think that that's really a good answer. However, there's some quick facts that we should probably look at historically. So Dan, why don't you take us through those?
Yeah, so we've dove into this thing, and like Ryan mentioned, we only have so much information to work with. This has kind of been presented now, and my understanding is that they're going to work through the details and kind of have a secondary delivery by fall, and then they're going to kick this initiative into action somewhere around the beginning of 2024. But let's look at some of the numbers that they put forth here, including they want to budget this at about $4 billion over the next 3 years and have a commitment of $12 billion over the next 10 years. And this is for delivering more homes to people faster. So they're putting forth about a $1.2 billion per year commitment to this plan. If we look at the average, let's call it build of a family home is about $800,000 or so. That is going to equate to 15,000 new homes over the next 10 years. That's 1,500 homes a year that this budget can kind of build, it looks like. Effectively, this works out to about an additional 5 pre-sale projects, if you will, per year kind of thing. Now, knowing the immigration targets as well, these obviously don't quite align even here, but at least they're trying. At least this has been very much put to the forefront of how important it is to have the governments align here and put forth further housing. This is building upon this new plan, the Homes for People plan, is building on the 2018 Homes for BC plan, which was the largest investment at its time in its time of housing affordability, at a tune of $7 billion. This was 5 years ago. It introduced effective tools to tackle speculation and increase the number of rentals. That was 2018. Well, where are we today? We're only 5-10% off of all-time high prices. Rental rates, same thing, just off or at all-time high rates here. So that $7 billion injection either wasn't enough or wasn't executed properly because, again, we're looking here 5 years later. I think anyone looking at house prices in 2018 would take those any day over prices at 2023 here. Let's also remember another housing promise that was made back in 2014-ish by our current Trudeau, who's in power, our prime minister here. Now, he had a housing plan. He campaigned on a housing plan. And at that time, in 2014, housing was already identified as being too expensive, if you will. And that's why people and politicians like himself campaigned on affordable housing. At that time, the average house in Canada was about $390,000. Today, 9 years later, those prices have doubled. So that plan either didn't work, wasn't effective, or just wasn't executed properly. So this is not an easy issue. And people have been talking about affordable homes in BC and in Ontario and in Canada as a whole now for decades. And yet we're in this environment where prices are going up and up and up and up. Okay, so to get back on track here. The province is on track to deliver about 108,000 homes completed or under construction within the next 5 years. And then, of course, tens of thousands of more homes to come through other avenues. These are essentially, when we know the growth of our province here, largely, I would think, already accounted for. I mean, this is a lot of private companies, developers that are building this. This isn't just on top of. This isn't just the government's plan. This is the public sector here building and, of course, selling to the public as well. So not sure if that kind of number is enough to keep housing affordable, if you will. Obviously a subjective term. There was also the Belonging in BC Homelessness Plan, which is delivered through initiatives across the government and supported by investments of about $1.2 billion in the budget for 2023. And there was $633 million in that same budget just last year. Now, homes for the homeless and sheltering those in need is something we can obviously get behind and support. Again, being top level here, we don't know what the details are, and we don't know how this money is going to be spent or where or how it's going to help. We're recording this one on April the 5th. And the headline on the news today, when I watched Global TV at 12 p.m., was, of course, the fact that they were completely clearing out the tent encampments on basically the Main and Hastings area. And the people that were getting removed were basically also coming forth and saying, look, we have nowhere to go. You know, it's great that you want us off the street, but where are you going to put us? Because the SROs, for example, are apparently worse off, and they felt more safe and comfortable on the streets than they did in SROs. Both really, really unfortunate, terrifying, and sad situations to be in. But again, it's not like they're just saying, hey, here's the keys to your new home that our plans have built. So a bit of a tough scenario there. We're going to see how this obviously unfolds, but the focus, the intent, all things are great, but the devil or the delivery is definitely going to be in the details here. So we're going to see where this pans out over the next 5 years, I guess. But in reality here, let's keep in mind, there's more than 100,000 people that moved to BC in 2021 and 150,000 last year, the most in 60 years. And as we know, immigration targets for 2023 are set to beat that nationally. And we, in all likelihood, can expect a huge chunk of those to land within BC, meaning that we might see it over 150,000 in 2023.
Wow, those big numbers. And honestly speaking, I hope $1.2 billion is enough to help fix the single room occupancy issues that clearly the homelessness are facing. Something drastic needs to happen here in terms of how we help not only the situation, but help these people with dignity as well. So I'm all for it. I just would love to see what the actual details of the plan look like. And most of the time, Dan, when we do plans, we have dates, execution times, and responsibilities and accountabilities, none of which I see here. Anyhow, so I want to get into the secondary suites portion of this, because I think the government's going to try and sell this part of the plan pretty hard, because it sounds good when you look at it at a top level. But then what we did is we actually broke down just by looking at it and do the numbers actually work? Do they even make sense, right? So the legislation, which will get introduced probably in 2024 here, homeowners will be able to access a forgivable loan of 50% of the cost of the renovations up to a maximum of $40,000 over 5 years. However, there's one stingy little stipulation here. The loan can be forgiven if the homeowner meets all conditions laid out in the program. All of those conditions we haven't seen. So we're not quite sure what those conditions are, but the main one here is including renting their unit out at below market rates for a minimum of 5 years. All right. Just that statement alone creates some problems. So let's get into it here. The pilot is expected to be open to at least 3,000 homeowners for the first 3 years. So my question is, are you really saving any money doing this? And if you're a homeowner and you want to take advantage of maybe doing a renovation, a $40,000 renovation, maybe you've got a basement suite and it needs some love in order to get renovated or in order to get rented out. So you take on this $40,000 option and you spend, if you will, $20K of your own money to renovate the space. And the other 20 will be reimbursed by the government. Okay, so let's say once that's done, you're able to now rent out your basement suite for, I don't know, Dan, let's say a market rent for a nice basement suite in East Vancouver, somewhere around $3,000. For the sake of this exercise, let's look at it as $3,000. So you times that by 12, it's 12 months in a year, $36,000 over the 5-year term that the government requires you to do that. That's $180,000 in net rent that you could produce in your basement suite. That's a staggering number, just hearing that. Let's consider now that you have to rent this at under market rent. Now, we don't know what that stipulation is. Is it 50%? Is it 25%? Either way, let's run it at both here. So at 50%, you're instead of $3,000 a month, you're at $1,500 a month. Times 12, that's $18,000 a year. Times 5 years, that's $90,000 in rent. Okay. However, I'm now $90,000 in lost rent from the other scenario, right? Because I was $180,000 there. So now I'm $90,000 in lost rent, but I get to recover my $20,000 from the government. Thank you very much. So this leaves me with a net loss of $70,000 in rent over that time period, had I just gone about it in without the government incentive. Not making a whole lot of sense here. Now, let's reduce that down to 25% because we don't really know what the actual number is for under market rent. So even using 25%, $2,250 a month times 12 times 5 is $135,000. That's still a net loss of $45,000 plus your $20K we're now at a total loss of $25,000, even if it's 25% below the actual under market rent. So you're going to have to, under market rent is going to need to be somewhere in like 10% less, which doesn't make really rent affordable at all. So I'm not quite sure how we get to the affordable number. And then how do we create a net win for the person who's doing the renovation? Because if I just decided to spend my own $40,000 on my basement suite, and I was able to rent it now for $3,000 a month, then my net gain's $140,000 over that time period. I'm not dealing with anywhere near the level of loss that the government's offering me here. So why would I take part in this? I don't understand. Again, the major variable here is what is under market rent. And I would also say the other major variable, Dan, is material cost and labor shortages. So what can you get for your $40,000 would be my other question.
For sure. Now, I will say there is one very smart thing that they're doing here that I agree wholeheartedly with. And that is essentially the first line that you mentioned, that the legislation is going to make secondary suites allowed in every community in BC. I definitely like that. I can speak to, my goodness, probably a half dozen clients who literally suited their basement in areas where it wasn't zoned for it so that they could help provide housing and offset their mortgage. And their neighbors came poking around and basically called them out on it. And, had the local governments come in and crack down on that.
The other thing I'm kind of struggling with here too is, okay, so the renter has to be in there for 5 years. Okay, granted, I think if a renter is going to be in a neighborhood like this, maybe they've got a small family and that child is probably going to school. So they probably don't want to leave after 5 years. So, and the rental laws suggest that, there's only marginal increases that we can do or that are available every year for landlords to increase. So if at 5 years now and that person is getting incredibly low rent, where is their incentive to ever leave? And then what happens here is my losses begin to compound and compound and compound. They don't get any better. So I don't know how this actually works out in terms of being a solution, a long-term solution. I think it sounds great on paper, but as you see, I don't know if the government expects people not to do the math or if they didn't do it themselves, but there's not enough detail here for us to really work this out where it makes sense.
It's reminiscent too of, let's just look at the last couple of years here, where we were very short of laborers and skilled laborers in the construction field here. And so when the government comes and they're trying to provide lower income housing, they're trying to create these rental units, but the for-profit developers can afford to pay the construction workers more, all the work is going over there. Mm-hmm. And so there's a severe shortage and they can't even find people to help build these homes. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's super unfortunate, obviously, and it doesn't work in sort of a capitalist environment, but it is the environment we live in. Mm-hmm. So, you're trying to incentivize people, but you're doing so by basically telling them to lose money. Mm-hmm. Don't know how many people are going to be super motivated to take that on. Maybe I'm wrong, but
when you can do it yourself and you'll make back, when you don't need the government's loan, the loan's not going to help you. The loan makes it worse, makes it more expensive. True. So why wouldn't I just go to the bank and get a loan? And I would, and then I would just do the reno myself and make it back faster in my rental. It's not enough incentive. So anyways.
Yeah. But here, at a minimum, if this gets pushed through, you're looking at all of BC is essentially allowed secondary suites. I think that will help alleviate some of the housing issue. So there's definitely some wins here, right? At least on paper, it looks good. And speaking of wins, this one's important too. And this is in regards to the Housing Supply Act, as it's called. And that was brought into force just last fall. And it allows the province to set housing targets and support engagement with select municipalities. What does that mean? Well, essentially, immigration targets are set at like a federal and provincial level, and yet housing is set at a municipal level. And the two historically don't look to really talk to each other, as we can currently see. Way more immigration than our housing infrastructure can handle. And so the fact that they're essentially putting an act forward that allow the two to talk to each other, or maybe even force them to talk to each other to create a plan saying, we're going to bring in X amount of people into the province this year. You need this many houses. Great. Let's work together. Maybe it turns into restricting immigration numbers to keep housing affordable. Either way, there's a conversation happening now, which I think is a definite win. It's in the right direction here. And it's hilarious that it took till 2022 to really recognize this. But either way, we can't look backwards, but this does look to help moving forward here.
Yeah. And the vacancy tax is looking like it's going to get in not the actual taxable amount, but the region that it covers is looking like they're going to expand it here. Again, don't really know too much more about that other than areas with extremely low vacancy rates. They're going to step up efforts to improve compliance in those areas, and they're going to consider expanding the spec and vacancy tax because it's really worked so well in terms of creating more affordability. But anyhow, more tax, right? That's always the answer. More tax, more areas. It's anyhow, the policy strokes don't work. Not like they used to.
Yeah. That's I'm not a fan of that, obviously, but at the end of the day, and I'm not a fan because, like Brian just said, we're not seeing it work. There's more tax on housing today than there's ever been, and yet houses are more expensive than they've ever been. It doesn't work, not in its current format. And speaking of that tax, there's yet another one. So they're expanding that one, and then they're adding another one. Big surprise here. Obviously, it's very easy to stroke the pen and add another tax compared to just building some homes, which can take years. So we are probably familiar or have heard of the flipping tax. Well, they're going to create another tax, and we don't have too many details at this time, but it's basically a redundant tax for the same thing. That it's going to be a rule that essentially treats people that if you sell a home over a certain amount of time after you've purchased it, that it becomes taxable. And this is on top of the flipping tax, which is exactly the same thing. I think if you sell within 1 year, there's a certain ratio of tax that you can pay. So this is, again, to prevent people from taking rundown homes and making them livable and then selling them to people. In essence, yes, they could hold them and rent them out, sure, but it's stopping the public market from improving existing households and making them livable for future residents. They haven't outlined the exemptions. Not much more we can say here other than it's just a tax on top of an existing tax that does the same thing. And it's taxing on my brain right now.
I do want to say one thing here because this is how this has affected me in my neighborhood. There's a house on the other side of our back lane, and halfway through last week, it caught fire. And it was a 108-year-old house. It's got, in my opinion, probably far too many tenants inside of it. And it's been completely run down. It definitely needs a renovation. There's certainly no sprinkler system or things like this for, the amount of people that are in there. Anyhow, it caught fire, for whatever reason. And, the home is decrepit. It's falling apart. It's literally falling over. And I can't think that there's probably aluminum wiring in there. You've probably got asbestos, vermiculite, all these different materials that, through fire will get disturbed. And now the place didn't burn down. So they'll repair parts of it and then people will go back inside. And we have an opportunity here where people could come in, you could hire someone, or you could sell the unit and they could come and redevelop it, or they could fix it correctly. But now under this anti-flipping tax, why would anybody endeavor to do that? They won't. They'll go to it's not that they won't renovate and flip homes. They'll just go do it in a different market where they won't get taxed. And then that market will get better homes, better inventory, better stock. So these are all pen strokes without having really engaging formal discussions around whether or not they're actually going to create a better environment for the people who need housing in Vancouver. Or in the province for that matter. I feel like we're lacking a lot of discourse, especially with industry experts.
Well, what's the saying? The road to hell was paved with good intentions. a little bit of this. Now, again, we're not here just to poke holes through this thing, and it's not like we're solving the housing market ourselves, but it's also not the role that we have placed ourselves in. At the end of the day, I think there are some really good ideas here. This is such a complex problem that not one person or one group is ever going to solve it, but there's clearly some action steps here. Some of it is smart. Some of it we disagree with. At the end of the day, we'll see where it all pans out. But fundamentally, there obviously needs to be some major shifts here, or we're just going to see housing like what happened, in the Trudeau era, double again in the next 9 years, where suddenly the average home price will be 2.4 million. It's not sustainable.
Crazy.
So build. Let's see more houses. Ryan, you want to wrap this one up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really kind of covers it, Dan. We talked about, how some of this policy, like you said, there's some good ideas in here, but I don't see the execution. And I feel like politicians need to come out and tell people how it really is and realize that maybe they're not going to get hung for that. You know what I mean? Like, come out and talk about the real problems. Let people know just how bad the issue is. Hey guys, listen, the federal government over the last 30 years really ignored the housing that we needed. And I know we're going to put $12 billion towards this, but the real number is $35 billion that we don't have. This is how big the problem is. Give people some perspective so they can deal with the change. We don't ever hear this. We just hear spatterings of some plan at a high level. And until we get to the details, until we get to accountability, till we start seeing how the plan's going to roll out, when the dates are, then I'll start biting into this like it's got some meat. But right now, I think it's a lot of promises. We've seen it before. And until we actually see new houses on the ground and people paying less for them, then I'll give it some credence. So with that being said, I know I'm a tough critic here of the government, but again, more discourse. I think we'll go somewhere with consulting with industry experts too. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll see you guys next week.